The north is cold and full of whispers.
The first thing was the smell, not the iron and gut stench of a dying man's tent, not the wood smoke and wet leather of household guards standing too close because they knew the end was coming. Something sweet, cedar and crushed flowers pressed into wax, the smell of rooms where women ruled. Robert Baratheon's eyes opened. The ceiling was wrong. He lay there for 3 full heartbeats staring at it. Carved oak panels, lacquered dark swaying with a slow rhythmic creak. A room that moved. He had been in rooms that moved before, on ships crossing the stepstones, but this was different, slower, the grind of wheels against packed earth. He was in a carriage. He was in a carriage, and the boar had ripped through his belly, not his hand drove to his stomach. Smooth cloth, silk. He clawed at it and found no wound, no bandage, no seared flesh where Pycelle's wine had blunted the pain enough to keep him breathing, but not enough to keep him from feeling every inch of those tusks going in. Nothing. He found nothing. He sat up, too small. The room was too small. Cushioned benches, windows curtained in Lannister crimson, a silver pitcher on the bolted table engraved with a crowned stag. He knew this wheelhouse. He'd commissioned the damn thing, had the carpenter swear it was the finest in the 7 kingdoms, and then never ridden in it because it moved at the pace of a wounded ox. Cersei loved it. His hands were on the bench. Robert looked down at them, and the world tilted hard. A child's hands, not the hands he'd carried for 50 years, scarred from the warhammer's grip, thick through the knuckles, one finger broken twice that had never set quite straight. These were soft, unblemished. The nails were clean and trimmed. Slim fingers, short fingers, and they were shaking, trembling against the silk cushion like something small caught in the dark. Not my hands. He breathed. Forced it, in through the nose, the way he'd learned in the camps when the rage rose too fast and you had to hold it or you'd ruin something you needed. Cedar and crushed flowers and the cloying residue of candied fruit left on the table. He breathed until the shaking slowed. Think. He was not dead. Or he was dead and the gods had a sense of cruelty that exceeded anything he'd given them credit for. He was in a body that was not his. Small, young, highborn from the silk and the curtains and the crest on the silver. Inside the royal wheelhouse, moving north on the King's Road, the progress. We've just left King's Landing. The knowledge settled into him not like relief, but like a verdict being read aloud. He knew exactly where he was in time, the progress north. Weeks of road ahead of him. And at the end of that road, a man who was still alive. A man who in another life, his life, the life that had just ended on a camp bed with a boar's blood on his hands and wine in his blood, would be asked to be Hand of the King, and would say yes, and would be dead within the year. Robert and Joffrey looked at the small, soft hands in his lap. He knew whose hands they were. He'd felt many things about Joffrey across the years. Bafflement, a grinding, private irritation he'd smothered under drink, because what kind of man resented his own son for being delicate? A disconnection he'd blamed on politics, on Cersei, on the 1,000 excuses a man builds when he can't bear to look at what's directly in front of him. He knew now that the excuses had been precisely that. Because he was sitting in Joffrey Baratheon's body, breathing through Joffrey Baratheon's lungs, and the truth of what that meant, whose blood ran in these veins, whose face he was wearing, sat in the center of his chest like a blade someone had forgotten to remove. The curtain at the far end of the wheelhouse moved. Robert and Joffrey went still, the way you went still watching treeline on a march when you felt the scouts before you saw them. Cersei entered, travel dress, green silk, gold at the collar, hair arranged as though an army had attended it that morning. She carried a cloth in one hand and a dish of candied plums in the other, and her face wore the expression he had learned over 15 years of cold marriage, performing affection with no audience present, the habit so practiced she no longer knew when it was on. She moved toward him and every muscle in this small body went rigid. He had studied her the way you studied an enemy camped too close to your position to ever fully sleep. Every motion deliberate, every word chosen for effect, the real Cersei surfacing only when she was afraid or when she thought she'd won. He watched her cross the wheelhouse and had the sudden vertiginous sensation of looking at something from entirely the wrong angle, the lion from inside the cage. She sat beside him, pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Her skin was cool. You slept through the morning. Her voice was soft. The register she kept specifically for Joffrey, different from Myrcella, different from Tommen, slightly more careful than both, the way you speak to something you are not entirely certain of. The Kingswood is behind us. We made good time. Robert and Joffrey said nothing. She held out the dish. The smell of the candied plums hit him, and he thought, with the full force of Robert Baratheon's contempt for softness deliberately cultivated, that he would rather eat the dish itself. You should eat something. Her fingers moved to his collar, adjusting the doublet at his throat, the gesture so automatic it barely registered on her face. You've been pale since yesterday. I've asked Pycelle to examine you when we stop at... Leave me, mother. Her hand stopped, not with Joffrey's whine, not with the high grasping petulance of a boy asserting control he hadn't earned. Robert's cadence, flat and direct, pushed through a 12-year-old's throat, and arriving slightly wrong in pitch, lower, slower, weighted with something that had no business being inside a child's voice. I am thinking. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. He counted. Cersei's hand fell from his collar. She didn't move immediately. She was running calculations behind those green eyes, the performer behind the mask working faster than the mask could keep up with. Something in Joffrey's face was not giving her the return she expected. Of course, she said at last. The warmth didn't vanish. It never vanished. It was too practiced for that. It simply retreated behind something more watchful. Rest. I'll have food brought when we stop. She left. Robert and Joffrey sat in the swaying wheelhouse and let himself breathe. Outside the curtain, from the position he knew would be occupied, always occupied, in whatever weather, at whatever hour, there was silence. But it was a specific silence, the silence of a large man who had just heard something he was turning over very carefully before deciding what to do with it. Robert had known Sandor Clegane the way you knew a good dog, not closely, not warmly, but with the particular respect you gave to something that was genuinely what it was, without performance, without apology. The hound was not complicated. He was violent and he was loyal and he had no patience for pretension, and he saw through people the way a cold wind saw through a thin cloak. He had been 3 feet from the wheelhouse window when Robert and Joffrey told the Queen to leave. He was now very, very quiet. The wheels ground against the King's Road. Outside the curtains the progress moved. Hundreds of horses, supply wagons, outriders, the entire slow machinery of the crown transporting itself north. Robert and Joffrey listened to it the way a commander listened to the sounds of his own camp. Assessing, counting, beginning. He reached forward and pushed the curtain aside. The road unrolled behind them, south, back toward the capital. Afternoon light on packed dirt, the faint smudge of the city dissolving into the distance. 7 weeks of road between here and Winterfell. 7 weeks of this curtained box, and Cersei watching him recalibrate, and the hound going quiet outside the window. 7 weeks. He let the curtain fall. Ned is alive. There is still time. He smelled the north before he saw it. 9 weeks on the King's Road, and the air had been changing for days. The soft rot of the riverlands giving way to something harder, cleaner, carrying the memory of ice even in late summer warmth. By the time the wheelhouse ground to its final halt and the shouts of outriders carried back through the curtain, he was already watching through the gap he'd stopped pretending he wasn't watching through. Winterfell rose from the gray morning the way he remembered it. Not with fondness. Robert Baratheon had never catalogued his emotions in terms of fondness, but he recognized it the way you recognized a sword that had served you well. The shape of the towers, the mass of the granite walls, dark from old rain, the smoke from a dozen chimneys threading up into a sky that had decided, somewhere over the neck, to stop being southern. A place built to endure, a place that knew what was north of it and had decided, 1,000 years ago, to stand there anyway. He let the curtain fall. Behind him, Cersei's women were organizing her exit, the small, controlled chaos of a court reassembling its public face. Cersei stood at the far end of the wheelhouse checking her reflection, performing the ritual concentration of a woman who understood that arriving anywhere was also arriving at a negotiation. She had been watching him for 9 weeks. Not constantly, not with anything he could call suspicion outright, but with the peripheral attention of a woman whose most important asset was the child currently sitting across from her, behaving like a different child. He'd caught her at it 3 or 4 times. Each time he'd given her nothing to grab hold of. Not Joffrey's sulk, not Joffrey's quick cruelty, a boy sitting quietly, eating less than expected, watching the road. The wheelhouse door opened. Cold air and the organized noise of a castle receiving its king. Robert and Joffrey stepped out. The Winterfell courtyard was full of people. Household staff arranged in the way all households arranged themselves for royal visits. Everyone who could stand upright, positioned by rank, trying to look simultaneously prepared and unrehearsed. He read the yard in a single sweep, the sweep of a man who'd spent 40 years reading camps and courts. Catelyn Stark, Lady of Winterfell, red-haired, straight-backed, managing the anxiety of hosting a king she hadn't chosen with the iron composure of her breeding. Her eyes went to the royal children first. Standard, the younger ones. A boy of 7 with a climber's build and Ned's coloring. Bran, both knees intact, alive, looking at the wheelhouse with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to perform deference. A toddler balanced at Catelyn's hip, with Tully red in his hair, and standing at his mother's left shoulder, posture not quite settled, the straightness of someone who had recently started remembering to stand straight. Robert and Joffrey stopped moving. He'd had 9 weeks to prepare for this. He'd told himself in the dark of the wheelhouse, when the road sounds blurred into a constant grind, and he had nothing to do but think, that he had prepared for this. He was wrong. Robb Stark was 14 years old and he was alive, hair that hadn't yet settled into the auburn it would darken to, still carrying summer red in it, the red of a boy rather than a king. Face completely unlined, jaw already Ned's, shoulders beginning to broaden into the frame that would fill out over the next 2 years into something formidable. He carried no crown, no grief, no wound at the twins, no betrayal carved permanently into his face the way betrayals eventually carved themselves, whether a man invited them or not. He was just standing there in the courtyard looking very young. Robert and Joffrey breathed once, carefully, through his nose. Across the yard, the other Robert was happening. Old Robert descended from his horse the way he did everything outside of war, with the momentum of a man whose body remembered when it could do more than it currently managed. He hit the ground and the yard noticed it, not from weight alone but from the force of presence a man carries when he has spent a lifetime filling rooms larger than himself. He bellowed across the cobblestones with both arms already spreading, with the uncomplicated joy of a man who had exactly one person in the world whose company he genuinely preferred. "Ned, you've gotten fat." It was the most Robert thing imaginable. It tore through the formal arrangement of the welcome like a thrown axe, and Ned Stark stepped forward from the head of the household with the ghost of a smile crossing a face not built for smiling. And the two of them came together the way old soldiers did. No ceremony, just the grip and the impact, and 40 years of surviving the same things pressing through the contact. Robert and Joffrey watched his former self embrace his best friend. He had approximately 4 seconds before the courtyard's attention turned to the Crown Prince and whatever performance Joffrey was expected to give. He used 3 of them just looking at Ned. The real Ned, not the man he'd reconstructed from memory 1,000 times over, the actual weight and height of him, the gray already at his temples, the honesty that lived in his face so openly it made him dangerous in a city that fed on hidden things. He'd gotten this man killed, not with intent, not with malice, but with the particular selfishness of a man who needed someone too badly to ask what that need would cost. He'd handed Ned Stark the most dangerous seat in the realm because he couldn't bear the thought of sitting next to someone he didn't trust. And Ned had gone south and been honest in a court that punished honesty, and he had done nothing in time to stop any of it. Robert and Joffrey started walking, the courtyard noticed. Not from any dramatic gesture, simply because the Crown Prince was moving in a direction that didn't align with anything Joffrey Baratheon had ever done. He should have been hanging back, bored performing the minimum of obligatory presence before retreating to see his rooms. Instead, he was crossing the yard with the directness of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Old Robert pulled back from the embrace and turned, tracking the movement. Ned turned. His face arranged itself into the expression he kept specifically for the Crown Prince, the careful neutral courtesy of a man managing his honest opinion behind a door he'd decided to keep closed. Robert and Joffrey put his arms around Ned Stark's waist. He couldn't reach the shoulders. This body didn't have the height for it, so he gripped at the waist and pressed his forehead against Ned's chest and held. The way you held on when you weren't sure if this was the last time, when you'd had reason in another life to know that last times come without announcing themselves. The courtyard went quiet, not the quiet of outrage, the quiet of 100 people watching something they couldn't immediately categorize, deciding to wait before deciding what to do with it. Ned Stark had gone completely still. His hands hovered at his sides, not returning the embrace, not withdrawing from it. A man who had walked into an unexpected current and was holding himself motionless while he assessed the depth. Robert and Joffrey pitched his voice into the wool of Ned's cloak, low enough that the nearest person to catch it was 4 feet too far, "It's good to see you, Ned." "Not Joffrey's register." Nothing in it was Joffrey's register. The voice was 12 years old, and it said what only Robert Baratheon said in that exact way. "Not glad to see you." Not the formal grace of a prince acknowledging a lord. The blunt, unguarded statement of a man who had missed his friend and was only now, after 9 weeks of wheels on stone, allowing himself to say so. Ned's hands came up, slowly, settling onto the boy's shoulders with the care of a man handling something that might mean more than it appeared to. His chin dropped. Robert and Joffrey felt it from below, the angle of a man looking down at a face he was trying to read in bad light. Robert and Joffrey stepped back before he could read too much. The court was still watching. Cersei's expression had moved somewhere behind her face, where he couldn't follow it. The mask was on, fully operational, but the thing operating the mask was working considerably harder than it had been 60 seconds ago. Old Robert, from 8 feet away, had gone very still. He was looking at his son, the son he'd made without knowing it, in a woman he'd married without loving, and he was looking with an expression that surfaced and disappeared too fast to name. Something that might have been recognition if Robert Baratheon had been a man who recognized things about himself. It was gone before it could be called anything. Robert and Joffrey turned away from both of them and looked at the gray towers of Winterfell against the gray sky. Somewhere in the yard behind him, Robb Stark was still standing with both knees intact and a face that didn't yet know what it would be asked to carry. The gate closed behind the last of the progress. They were inside. He'd been watching the boy for 4 days. Not with the obvious tracking of someone conducting surveillance. Robert and Joffrey had learned in the first week of the progress that 12-year-old boys standing at windows watching things made people nervous in ways that generated questions he didn't want to answer. He watched the way you watched weather, peripherally, consistently building a picture from accumulated detail rather than direct observation. Bran Stark climbed everything. Not occasionally, not when the mood took him. With the regularity of breathing, the way some boys drummed their fingers, or chewed their lips, or found other unconscious outlets for the energy that lived in young bodies without permission. The stables first thing in the morning. The gatehouse at midday. The first keep's broken steps in the afternoon. He moved across Winterfell's walls and towers with the unhesitating confidence of a child who had never once hit the ground and therefore believed in the complete and reasonable logic of someone who had never been proven wrong, that he never would. Robert and Joffrey watched him cross the yard on the 4th morning and registered the direction, the broken tower. He was out of the room before the calculation had fully surfaced. He found Ned in the great hall breaking his fast with 2 of his captains, maps of the northern estates spread between the bread and the ale. Catelyn was there, not eating, watching the door the way women watch doors in houses, where everything arrived from the outside and was then managed from within. The room went slightly quiet when Robert and Joffrey entered, the specific quiet of a space calibrating itself to royal presence, and he crossed it without acknowledging the calibration and stopped at Ned's shoulder. A word, Lord Stark. Ned looked up. The 2 captains found somewhere else to look. Catelyn's attention sharpened, but she didn't speak. Ned said something to his men, pushed his chair back, and they moved to the window alcove at the hall's far end. Robert and Joffrey waited until the nearest servant was 10 feet away and kept his voice at a level that carried approximately that far. The broken tower, he said it flat, no preamble. Bran climbs it, he'll go today, this morning, within the hour. Ned's expression didn't change. My son climbs every structure in Winterfell, he always has. Not every structure has something in it he shouldn't see. The stillness again, the computation. I need 2 of your men. Robert and Joffrey kept his eyes level. Yours, Lord Stark, not household staff, men with swords who will do exactly what you tell them and speak of it to no one afterward. I need them at the tower's base in the next 20 minutes. I need them told to intercept Bran on the exterior wall before he reaches the upper windows, and to hold him there without alarm until you and I arrive. Until we arrive, Ned said it carefully. You intend to come. I intend to make sure it's done correctly. He held Ned's gaze. There are people in that tower who need to be found by you specifically, Lord Stark. Not a servant, not a guard who doesn't understand what he's seeing. You. Ned was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved once toward Catelyn, not seeking permission, cataloging variables. The dreams again, he said. The dreams again. It wasn't a comfortable word for either of them. Robert and Joffrey had offered it in the crypts because it was the only frame that kept Ned from having to decide definitively what he believed. The dreams were a door left ajar. Ned, being the man he was, he'd walked back past that door several times in the days since, and stood outside it doing the mathematics of what he'd heard against the mathematics of what was possible. He hadn't shut it. 2 men, Ned said. 2 men. 20 minutes. The broken tower was abandoned in the way old wounds were abandoned. Not forgotten, just no longer tended. The stairs inside were sound but unswept. The upper floors opened to weather through gaps where the roof had given up. Nobody used it. Nobody had reason to. That was the point of it. Robert and Joffrey stood at the tower's base with Ned, and felt the damp coming off the old stone and listened. The 2 guards Ned had pulled from his household, older men, quiet men, the kind who had learned that the most useful thing in a lord's service was sometimes knowing when to look at the ground, were positioned on the exterior scaffold, out of sight from the upper windows, covering the approach Bran would take along the wall. The voices reached them before they'd been there a full minute. Not words at first. Tone. The rise and fall of 2 people talking without having to perform the talking. The specific frequency of a conversation held in a private space by people who believed themselves unheard. The lower register was unmistakable. Ned heard it and his jaw set in a way Robert and Joffrey had seen on battlefields. Robert and Joffrey caught his arm. "Witnesses," he said very quietly. "We need witnesses." Ned looked at him. "Not us." He held Ned's gaze until Ned understood, and then released the arm and stepped back to the tower's entrance. Above them, across the exterior scaffold, there was a small sound, movement. Bran's distinctive climbing, not careless but absorbed, all attention on the stone and the grip and the next hold. He'd come along the wall from the east side, following the route he always followed, and he was ascending with the unhurried efficiency of a child doing something so habitual it required no conscious thought. One of Ned's men moved. It was done quietly, without alarm, the guard stepping into Bran's path on the scaffold 6 feet below the window level and speaking in a low voice that didn't carry. Bran's climbing stopped. There was a brief exchange. The guard said something calm. Bran's voice came back, startled, not frightened. The protest of a boy interrupted rather than a boy afraid. The other guard was already there, flanking, and the whole intercept lasted less than 30 seconds. Bran did not reach the window. Ned was already moving for the tower door, and Robert and Joffrey was 3 steps behind him, and behind them both came the 2 household witnesses Ned had sent for, men who had no context for what they were about to see, but whose presence, whose living, breathing, sword-wearing presence, was the whole architecture of what came next. The staircase was narrow enough that they went single file. Robert and Joffrey could hear Ned's breathing in front of him, controlled, careful. The breathing of a man who had decided what he was going to do before he'd reached the first landing and was simply waiting for the stairs to run out. The door at the top was not latched. Ned pushed it open. The room had not been furnished. There was old straw, gray light through the broken sections of the roof, the smell of damp stone and something floral that had arrived from outside and didn't belong here. 2 people in the only dry corner, caught mid-sentence, turning at the sound of the door with the specific quality of motion that belonged to people in the act of being somewhere they had constructed an entire architecture of deception to occupy. Cersei moved first. Her composure was extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary. Even now, watching it from the far side of a relationship he'd spent 20 years drowning rather than examining, he could acknowledge it. She had the dress arranged and her face arranged in approximately the same amount of time, and the expression she produced was outrage. Not guilt, outrage, the performance of a queen finding her private time violated, and it was almost good enough. Jaime Lannister did not move. He stood in the corner of the broken tower with the stillness of a man who had been in impossible positions before and understood that the first thing you did was count the variables. He counted them. His eyes went to Ned, processed, went to the witnesses, processed, went to the 12-year-old standing at the hand's shoulder with no particular expression on his face, stopped there. His hand was on his sword hilt, not drawn, resting there with the automatic contact of a man whose body and blade had been in conversation for 30 years. Robert and Joffrey stepped past Ned. He was aware of how this looked. A boy, a child in a doublet with clean nails walking across a broken floor toward the finest swordsman in the 7 kingdoms. He walked anyway, the way Robert Baratheon walked toward things, without consulting the part of the brain that tallied risk, because that part of the brain had learned early that tallying risk too carefully was how you ended up standing still. He stopped 10 feet from Jaime. He looked at the hand on the hilt. "Stand down, sir." His voice in this body was still wrong for the authority it carried. too light, too young, the pitch not yet his. But the register was Robert's, and the eye contact was Robert's, and the complete absence of fear was something Jaime Lannister, who had looked into the eyes of a great many men in his life, had not seen coming from this direction. You stand in Lord Stark's hall, and this is the king's hand. He let a pause occupy the space where a threat would normally live, and then didn't make the threat. I suggest you take your hand from that sword. Behind Jaime, Cersei said nothing. She was looking at her son. For the first time since King's Landing, she was not performing. The mask had slipped precisely 1 centimeter, and through that gap was something Robert and Joffrey recognized from 30 years of marriage. Not the lion's rage, not the schemer's calculation. Something rawer, something that looked, in this broken light in this broken tower, almost like fear. Jaime's hand came away from the hilt, not fast, deliberately. The motion of a man making a choice rather than following an order, which was a distinction that mattered to him more than most things. He looked at the 2 witnesses. He looked at Ned, who had not spoken and would not speak because Ned had understood from the moment they entered that speaking first was not his role here. He looked at the boy. He said nothing. Robert and Joffrey held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked back to Ned's side and looked out through the broken section of the roof at the gray Winterfell sky, and below them through the stone he could hear Bran Stark on the scaffold asking Ned's guard, in the clear, carrying voice of a 7-year-old with no understanding of what he'd just been steered away from, when he was going to be allowed to climb the rest of the way up. The trident was 2 miles back. He'd felt it before he'd seen it. The way the road changed character as it descended toward the river crossing, the quality of the light through the trees becoming something flatter, the riverlands asserting themselves in the smell of moving water and old reeds. When the ford came into view to the column's lead outriders, he'd made himself look at it. The Ruby Ford. Low in late summer, the current running clear over the stones where it ran red in his memory, where the rubies from a shattered prince's armor had scattered into the water while the warhammer came down. He'd looked at it for as long as it took the wheelhouse to cross. Then he'd let the curtain fall. That was 4 hours ago. The Progress was making camp now in a meadow a quarter-mile off the road, the machinery of a traveling court assembling its temporary city with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this every night for 4 months. Cook fires. The horse lines, the particular arrangement of tents that placed the royal pavilion at the center and worked outward by rank until you reached the perimeter guards who had drawn the wrong lots and stood watch in the dark while everyone else ate. Robert and Joffrey moved through the camp the way he'd been moving through it for 6 weeks of the return journey. Not the center of it, not performing the crown prince for the assembled court, but the edges, the useful places, the places where things actually happened. He heard her before he saw her. The sound of a stick hitting another stick carries differently from the sound of a blade, lighter, faster, with a crack at the impact rather than a ring. He followed it to the tree line at the meadow's eastern edge where the camp's noise dropped enough that you could think, and found Arya Stark in the last of the afternoon light, practicing a form he almost recognized. She was using a stick approximately the length of a short sword. She'd found a fallen branch and stripped it, and she was moving through the same sequence of attacks over and over, with the focused repetition of someone who had been told once what the sequence was and had been running it alone ever since. The footwork was mostly right. The elbow was wrong on the extension, dropping when it should hold level, and she kept overcorrecting her weight on the back foot in a way that would put her on the ground against anyone who knew where to push. She heard him approaching and spun, stick coming up, chin dropping, ready. 10 years old and already the instinct was there, not the flinch of a girl who'd been trained to flinch, but the forward weight positioning of someone who'd decided some time ago that being small was not the same as being helpless. She saw who it was, and the chin came up and something shifted in her face through a sequence of reactions. Wariness, calculation, the specific look of someone who had already decided how to manage this encounter based on past experience. He stopped walking. "Your elbow," he said. She blinked. "On the extension. It drops. If you're putting a real blade into something with an elbow that drops, you lose the line and the strike goes wide." He watched her process this and watched her decide whether it was a trick. "The footwork is good. Your weight's wrong on the back foot, but the footwork is good." Arya Stark looked at him the way she looked at everything, without performing what she thought she was supposed to be feeling, which was the most dangerous. He'd liked her in another life, after everything. He'd never told her so, another item in a long ledger. "Syrio taught me," she said, not defensively, a statement of provenance. "Syrio is right about the footwork, work on the elbow." He turned to the nearest man within calling distance. one of the household staff moving between the cook fires, and raised his voice to the carrying level he'd been refining for weeks, calibrating it to the pitch that moved people without the shrillness Joffrey would have used. Find the master-at-arms traveling with the progress. Tell him the crown prince requires a training sword, wooden, short, balanced for a girl of 10. Tonight, before the camp sleeps. The man blinked and went. Arya stared at him. Stark or not, he said, mostly to himself, starting to move again. The North will need every fighter it can produce before this is done. He left her standing at the tree line with the stick in her hand, and something on her face that had replaced the wariness with a thing she hadn't decided what to call yet. He found Island Pain the way you found bad weather, by moving through the camp and encountering the absence of people before you encountered the man himself. The King's Justice sat alone at a small fire at the camp's northern edge, which was not where his tent was, which meant he was here by preference rather than assignment. He had his sword across his knees and a whetstone in his right hand, and he was drawing the stone down the blade in the long, even strokes of a man who had made this motion so many times it happened now below thought. His eyes were on the fire. The eyes never actually watched the fire. That was what you noticed if you watched Island Pain for more than a moment. The eyes appeared to watch the fire, but they were covering the perimeter, moving in small increments across every approach, registering everything. The eyes of a man who had been a weapon so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand somewhere without assessing the exits. Robert and Joffrey sat across the fire from him. Island Pain's whetstone did not stop. The fire snapped once, a piece of green wood in the stack. The progress of the stone down the blade was slow and even. Robert and Joffrey watched it for a while, the motion and the sound of it, and felt something settle in him that had been displaced since the wheelhouse outside King's Landing. This he understood. The work of maintaining a weapon, the intimacy of a man with the thing that defined him. "You've served 3 kings," Robert and Joffrey said. "Aerys, Robert, and whichever of us comes next." He kept his eyes on the blade. "Aerys took your tongue. Robert kept you because a king's justice who cannot speak is a king's justice who cannot be subpoenaed." He paused. Neither of them asked who you answered to. They assumed. The whetstone stopped. Island Pain's eyes came up from the fire and found the 12-year-old across from him with an attention that had nothing performative in it, the look of a man removing an assessment of something harmless and replacing it with an assessment of something that was not. "You answer to the king and to the law," Robert and Joffrey said. "Not to the queen, not to the Lannisters, not to whoever in King's Landing currently believes they are operating you." He held the dead man's gaze without difficulty. "When we reach the city, I want you to remember that. I want you to know that I know the difference between a man who serves the crown and a man who has been borrowed by people who do not own him." Island Pain looked at him for a long time. Then the whetstone resumed. Once, twice, the long, even stroke. It was not agreement, it was not loyalty. It was the motion of a man filing something away in a place he would retrieve it from when the time presented itself. Robert and Joffrey rose from the fire and moved back into the camp. He had been drilling for an hour in the dark at the meadow's southern edge when he heard the footsteps. He knew them before he turned. 6 weeks of return journey, and he'd catalogued every gate in the progress by sound. The particular weight and placement of a large man who had learned to move quietly and moved that way always, even when stealth served no purpose, because the body retains what the training engraves. He kept moving through the form. Short blade, one of the spares from the Progress's weapon supply, weight calibrated for speed rather than power. He was running a sequence he'd built from Robert's memory, the attacks that had worked in the crush when the warhammer wasn't the right answer, the close-range responses for when an opponent was already inside the arc of a big weapon and you needed something that didn't require room. He ran it again. The elbow level, the weight forward on the extension, again. The footsteps stopped. He kept drilling. The hound said nothing for a long time. He had that capacity. Most large men didn't, but Sandor Clegane had learned in the particular school of Joffrey Baratheon's service that silence was sometimes the only bearable option, and he'd become fluent in it. 6 weeks, Robert and Joffrey said without turning. "You've been watching me for 6 weeks. He brought the blade through the last movement of the sequence and lowered it and turned. The hound stood at the edge of the firelight from the nearest camp, far enough that half of him was in shadow. His arms were at his sides. His sword was sheathed. He was doing nothing threatening, which on the hound looked different than on other men because nothing the hound did was ever fully without threat. It was structural, built into the size of him and the ruin of his face and the particular quality of his stillness. He was looking at Robert and Joffrey the way a man looks at something he's been working out the nature of for 6 weeks and has finally reached a conclusion about. "You're not him," the Hound said. Not an accusation, the tone of a man stating something he'd verified past the point of uncertainty, the way you stated that the ground was solid or the water was cold, the kind of certainty that came from accumulation. Robert and Joffrey looked at him across the dark. "No," he said. "I'm not." The Hound's jaw shifted slightly, the working of a man who had prepared himself for denial and had received something else and was rearranging. "But you knew that," Robert and Joffrey said. "You've known it since the wheelhouse. Before the wheelhouse maybe, you were already watching at the gate." He kept his voice even. "The question I need answered is whether that's going to be a problem." The fire from the camp put orange light across the right side of the Hound's face and left the left side in shadow. The scarred side, the side Sandor Clegane had built an entire architecture of contempt to make the world stop looking at directly. He stood in the combined light and dark and looked at the 12-year-old boy with the short blade and the wrong footwork in the eyes that didn't belong in the face. The silence ran long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "Not for you," the Hound said. He turned and walked back into the camp. The city smelled the way it always smelled after an absence. You forgot it between visits. The accumulated insistence of 200,000 people and their animals and their refuse and their cooking fires all compressed into the bowl of land between the hills and the bay. Coming back to it from 9 weeks of open road, from the cold clean air of the north, the smell hit the back of the throat like a physical argument. Not entirely unpleasant. The rot underneath the salt and spice and wood smoke was at least honest. King's Landing had never pretended to be something other than what it was. An enormous, ungovernable accretion of human ambition built on a hill because a dragon landed there once, and everyone decided that meant something. Robert and Joffrey stood at the window of his chambers and watched the city in the early evening light and made his list. He'd been making it since the neck, adding to it, revising it, running the sequence of required moves against the sequence of available time, against the sequence of things that would go catastrophically wrong if he moved too fast or too slow or in the wrong order. The list was long. The time was not. Janos Slynt first. The gold cloaks were the lever Cersei would use if she moved, and she would move the moment she understood what was coming. And she would understand faster than most people because she was not stupid, and she had spent 15 years surviving a marriage that gave her no formal power by developing an instinct for threat that bordered on preternatural. Slynt had to go before she decided to use him. Pycelle second, slower, more surgical. The old maester was dangerous in the way that soft things in load-bearing positions were dangerous, not through strength but through the catastrophic consequences of removal done wrongly. Littlefinger last, and most carefully, and only when Ned and Stannis were both present, and the numbers were already in the room, because Littlefinger was the only person on the list who would genuinely enjoy a direct confrontation and would use the enjoyment to his advantage. But first was the thing he'd been turning over since the Ruby Ford. He requested the audience through the Chamberlain at mid-morning, framed it as a son's request to spend time with his father, and watched the Chamberlain's face do something involuntary at the word father. A small recalibration, the expression of a man who had served the household long enough to know that this phrasing, from this particular boy, in this particular direction, did not compute. He waited. Old Robert received him at midday. The king's private solar was not the throne room. It was not even the council chamber. It was a room that Robert Baratheon had selected in the first year of his reign, because it was far from the Iron Throne and had a decent southern exposure, and could fit a large chair, a large table, and enough wine to make the paperwork survivable, maps on the walls that had not been updated in a decade, a window that looked out over the bay, the remains of a meal pushed to the edge of the table and not yet cleared. Old Robert was standing when he entered, which was not what Robert and Joffrey had expected. Standing and not drinking, which was even less expected. Holding a piece of correspondence he put down when the door opened, with the specific motion of a man putting something away because he does not want it witnessed. He looked at his son. The problem with looking at old Robert was the problem of looking into a mirror that reflected something you had carefully stopped looking at. The weight was wrong now. The weight Robert Baratheon had been in his prime, the size of him that had made the Warhammer look proportionate, had gone somewhere else in the years of feasting and hunting, and drinking, and not being at war. What remained was still large but had the quality of a great thing gone soft at the edges, the frame still there underneath the ruin of it. The eyes were Robert's eyes, black, sharp, the eyes that missed less than the mouth let on. Those eyes were doing what they always did, reading the room. "You wanted to see me," old Robert said. The voice was Robert's voice, lower and rougher, and carrying the residue of last night's wine, and hearing it from the outside for the first time was a stranger experience than he'd prepared for. "The Chamberlain said you asked for private audience." "I did. Joffrey." The name landed with the complicated weight of a man who had never entirely resolved how to say it. "What is this?" Robert and Joffrey moved to the chair across the table from where old Robert was standing, and sat in it and looked at his past self across 10 feet of scarred oak and said, "I want to learn how to be a king." The silence that followed was brief and total. Old Robert's face moved through something that was not quite any single expression, amusement and its opposite arriving at the same moment and canceling each other, leaving something flatter and more attentive behind. He pulled out his own chair and lowered himself into it with the careful mechanics of a large man whose joints had begun filing formal complaints, and he looked at his son across the table. "You," he said, "me, want to learn," each word getting its own weight. "To be a king. Someone should." Robert and Joffrey held his gaze. It hasn't been going especially well. The sound old Robert made was not quite a laugh. It was the sound that preceded a laugh in a man who had been caught genuinely off guard and was deciding whether to be offended or to follow the thing that had caught him. He settled back in the chair. His eyes stayed sharp. "You're not Joffrey," he said. Not an accusation. The same flat register the Hound had used on the road south, the register of a conclusion rather than a question. Robert Baratheon had been many things, and stupid had never been one of them. Capable of ignoring his own intelligence when the alternative was sobriety, yes. But not stupid. "No," Robert and Joffrey said. "I'm not." Old Robert was very quiet. Robert and Joffrey leaned forward and put his elbows on the table and looked at the man he had been across the years and the impossible distance of it, and he said, "The night before we marched on King's Landing, the last night in camp before the Lannister banners had fully opened the gates, you and Ned Stark sat outside his tent with a skin of wine you'd found in a village the week before, and he asked you what you would have done if Rhaegar had lived, if he'd surrendered at the Trident, and you didn't answer for long enough that Ned thought you'd fallen asleep, and then you said, 'I would have had to let him live,'" old Robert said. His voice had gone very quiet. "Because Ned would have insisted, and I couldn't have refused him." "You told no one that," Robert and Joffrey said. "Not Cersei, not the small council, not the court historians who were already writing the songs. You told Ned, and you told him drunk, and he never repeated it." Old Robert's hands were flat on the table, still. "Storm's End," Robert and Joffrey said. "When the siege broke and the red wine blockade lifted, you rode south after King's Landing fell, and Stannis met you at the gates, and he told you what he'd done with the smuggler who'd run onions through the blockade, knighted him that morning for the food, cut 4 fingers from his hand that same hour for the years of smuggling. Both acts. Together. He held old Robert's eyes. You told him it was the most Stannis thing you had ever heard in your life. He didn't speak for long enough that you wondered if he'd taken it as an insult. You never found out which it was. A pause. You have not spoken of that conversation to anyone. Not Cersei, not Jon Arryn, not the council. Old Robert's grip on the table had not changed. His face had. "Who told you these things?" His voice came from somewhere low. "You did." Robert and Joffrey met his eyes. In a manner of speaking, the fire in the grate pushed light across the table between them. Old Robert's face was doing something it had not done in a long time. It was paying attention with all of itself, nothing held back for the wine or the wariness or the performance of kingship he'd been giving since Aerys' ashes cooled. He was looking at the 12-year-old in his son's chair the way he had looked at armies, with the whole assessment running behind the eyes, counting everything. "The children," Robert and Joffrey said. He said it plainly, without building toward it, without softening it. The way you said the thing that ended the debate. "All 3 of them, they are not yours." Old Robert did not move. "You have known it," Robert and Joffrey said. "Not suspected, known, for years. And you have been drinking the knowing down every night because the alternative required a decision you couldn't afford to make while the realm was held together with Lannister gold." He paused. "Jaime. It has always been Jaime." What happened on old Robert's face was not surprise. It was the face of a man from whom a wound has been opened that had been sealed long enough to forget the depth of it. The grief and the rage arriving together, the way they always did when the thing you'd been refusing to look at finally forced itself into the light. His jaw was tight. His hands had come off the table and were gripping the chair arms. "What do you want?" he said. The same words, almost, as Ned in the crypts. Everyone eventually arrived at this question when they had run out of room to disbelieve. Nothing yet. Robert and Joffrey held very still. I want you to stay the king, to sit the throne, sign the decrees, receive the lords, keep the court running the way it has been running. I want you to do nothing differently for the moment. He leaned forward slightly, and I want you to let me work. In the background, in the small rooms and the places where the actual decisions happen before they reach the throne. Let me be your hand in the shadows until I am old enough to stand in the light. Old Robert looked at him for a long time. And if I say no, he said, then I work slower and more of the wrong people stay in place, and when the things that are coming from the north arrive, we face them with a court full of men who serve Lannister gold instead of the realm. Robert and Joffrey held his gaze without moving. Say yes. Old Robert's grip on the chair arms loosened. He reached for the wine cup on the table, the automatic motion of a man reaching for the thing that had managed every hard moment for 20 years. His hand stopped before it touched the cup, sat there next to it. He looked at his son. Don't make me regret it, he said. The chair had been carried in that morning. Not the hand's chair, not the council members' chairs. Those were permanent fixtures carved into the room's architecture, the way everything in the Red Keep was carved in, by accumulated precedent rather than deliberate design. This was a smaller chair, placed slightly back from the table at the hand's right hand, close enough to be present and far enough to be technically outside the council's formal configuration. The Crown Prince observing, not voting, not seated at the table, the king's permission obtained through a brief written note, countersigned delivered to the chamberlain at first light. Robert and Joffrey had been in the room for 20 minutes before anyone else arrived, sitting in the chair and reading nothing, simply letting the room become familiar. The council chamber was not a large room. That was one of the things people didn't understand about power in the Red Keep. It did not live in the throne room, which was enormous and cold and built for intimidation rather than function. It lived here, in a room barely large enough to seat 8 people around a table covered in maps and correspondence, and the accumulated administrative weight of a continent being managed by men who each wanted the managing done differently. He noted the chairs, the distance between them, the sight lines, where the door sat relative to where each member would be when the conversation reached its most difficult passage. He was still noting when they arrived. Ned came first, which Robert and Joffrey had expected. The hand of the king arriving before the council was Ned being Ned, the man constitutionally incapable of showing up to a formal obligation at anything other than early. He took in the extra chair with a single look and said nothing. He had been given enough, in the crypts and in the days since, to recognize a prepared position when he saw one. Renly Baratheon arrived in good spirits, which was Renly's default mode regardless of whether the spirits were warranted. He was 20 years old and had the Baratheon size without yet having the Baratheon weight, and he moved through rooms as if the rooms had been decorated in anticipation of him. He saw Robert and Joffrey and the spirits modulated slightly into something more alert. He said something pleasantly irrelevant and took his chair. Pycelle settled in with the careful choreography of a very old man managing a body that had become an administrative problem. His robes were immaculate. His beard was combed. He had the quality of something preserved rather than aged, kept functional past its natural term by habit, and the particular stubbornness of men who have made themselves useful to powerful people for so long that usefulness has become their primary survival mechanism. He offered the Crown Prince a deep, practiced bow from his chair and received a nod in return that gave him nothing. Varys came in behind Pycelle and took his seat without ceremony, which was how Varys did everything, by occupying space before you'd quite registered the transition from his absence to his presence. He was already watching Robert and Joffrey when Robert and Joffrey looked at him, which meant he had been watching before that. He offered a small smile of the type that could mean several things simultaneously. Robert and Joffrey did not return it. Jaime Lannister did not attend. His absence was noted and not explained. Stannis Baratheon had arrived at King's Landing 3 days prior with a retinue of 40 men and an expression suggesting the journey had confirmed every negative opinion he had ever held about the South. He sat at the table's far end and had not spoken to anyone he didn't need to speak to since arrival, which meant he had spoken to Robert and Joffrey once, briefly in private, and to Ned once, briefly in private, and had otherwise occupied himself with documents related to the fleet. He sat with his back perfectly straight and his hands flat on the table, and his eyes moving with the slow, methodical assessment of a man counting everything and arriving at figures he did not yet trust. The last to arrive was Petyr Baelish. He was not late. He was precisely on time, which on Littlefinger was its own kind of statement. The precision of a man who had calculated that early arrival surrendered information and late arrival surrendered goodwill, and that the exact moment of scheduled commencement was the position of maximum control. He wore gray today, which was unusual. Littlefinger in gray rather than his customary mockingbird motley, a sartorial decision that said he had read the room before entering it. He took his chair with a pleasant, inclusive smile that distributed itself equally around the table and landed on the Crown Prince for exactly the same duration as everyone else. Not longer. The discipline of that was impressive. Robert and Joffrey noted it and filed it. Ned opened the session with the administrative business, 2 trade disputes requiring the hand's adjudication, a raven from the Warden of the East about road maintenance through the Mountains of the Moon, a request from the Night's Watch for additional funding that had been tabled 3 times in the past year. The table worked through them with the functional efficiency of a body that had been doing this long enough to have developed its own rhythms. Robert and Joffrey sat in his chair and said nothing and watched the rhythms. When the formal business was done and Ned indicated the floor was open, Robert and Joffrey leaned forward in the smaller chair and said pleasantly, "Lord Baelish, a question if the council permits." Everyone at the table recalibrated in small ways. Renly's pleasantness sharpened into curiosity. Stannis did not move. Pycelle's composure performed itself with slightly more effort than before. Varys folded his hands. Littlefinger's expression remained entirely open. "Of course, my prince. The crown's debt to the Iron Bank of Braavos." Robert and Joffrey kept his voice conversational, the voice of a boy doing his education. The most recent extension of the primary loan. What interest rate was secured? Littlefinger answered smoothly, a figure, precise, the kind of precision that communicated both competence and transparency. He had the number ready in the way that men who have been lying about numbers for years have all the numbers ready because the alternative was a pause, and a pause was a tell. "Interesting," Robert and Joffrey said. He looked at Ned. "Lord Stark." Ned reached into the correspondence stack in front of him and produced a letter. He placed it on the table and slid it toward the center without comment. "That is a letter from the Iron Bank's envoy, currently resident in King's Landing," Robert and Joffrey said. "It was obtained at my request and pertains to the terms of the extension Lord Baelish just described." He waited while the table registered the existence of the letter. "The rate in the letter is different from the rate Lord Baelish quoted. The difference, calculated against the principal and the payment schedule, represents approximately 40,000 gold dragons over the term of the loan. I am curious where the 40,000 went." The silence in the chamber was absolute. Littlefinger looked at the letter. He looked at it for exactly as long as was required to confirm its contents, without confirming that he was confirming its contents. And then he looked up with the expression of a man who has encountered an accounting discrepancy of precisely this nature many times before, and has 11 smooth explanations for each one. Robert and Joffrey did not let him choose one. "A separate matter," he said, moving on with the pleasant pace of someone conducting a tutorial rather than an execution. "The customs revenue from King's Landing's eastern harbor. The quarterly figures for the last 2 years show an irregular pattern in the 3rd quarter of each year, a dip of approximately 8% against projected volume that recovers fully in the 4th quarter. I found this curious. Lord Baelish, can you explain the mechanism behind the 3rd quarter shortfall?" Littlefinger began to explain it. He was very good at explaining things. The voice measured, the logic apparent, the specific figures ready. He had the explained version and the real version running simultaneously, and he was presenting the explained version with the confidence of a man who had never in his professional life met an audience that knew the difference. Robert and Joffrey let him finish. Then, "The Gilded Crane," he said, "the establishment on the Street of Silk, and the Silver Swan 2 streets north." He kept his eyes on Littlefinger's. "The licensing fees for these establishments are not reflected in the quarterly accounting from their district for either of the past 2 years. The district records show them as unlicensed. The establishments are clearly operating. They appear, from a review of the municipal rolls, to be among the largest revenue-generating properties in their quarter." He paused. "Who holds them?" Littlefinger said, "I would need to review the relevant documentation before—" "They are held through a property trust registered in Gulltown," Robert and Joffrey said. "The trust's charter names no individual owner, but was filed by a legal representative whose other clients include several properties in the Harbor District that also appear in the municipal rolls as unlicensed." He looked at the letter in the center of the table. "I am not making an accusation, Lord Baelish. I am asking for an explanation. I would like the full accounting of Crown finances, Every loan, every interest payment, every revenue figure, every expenditure, prepared for review within 2 weeks. The review panel will consist of the Hand, the Master of Ships, and a representative of the Iron Bank. He sat back. That seems reasonable. Littlefinger's smile was still present. His eyes were doing something the smile had no jurisdiction over. Robert and Joffrey turned to Pycelle as though moving between items on a list. Grand Maester, the king's treatment last month for the joint complaint in his left knee. You prescribed a specific course of milk of the poppy at a dosage you noted in the medical record as reduced from standard. He waited. The dosage actually administered as recorded in the dispensary log was not reduced. The dispensary log and the medical record are inconsistent. The medical record is in your hand. The dispensary log is in the hand of your assistant. He watched Pycelle's composure fracture along a line so fine only someone looking directly at it would see it. I mention this because the king's health is a matter of concern to me, and because I understand that medical confidence is the foundation of the Grand Maester's office, and that information leaving that confidence, traveling for instance to parties with an interest in knowing when the king's judgment might be chemically compromised, would be a serious breach of duty. He held the old man's eyes. I will be reviewing the Grand Maester's correspondence, as a precaution. Pycelle said nothing. Stannis, at the far end of the table, was looking at the 12-year-old in the smaller chair with an expression that was the closest Stannis Baratheon's face ever came to something that wasn't judgment. One final matter, Robert and Joffrey said. The commander of the City Watch, Janos Slynt. The Watch's operating budget for the past year exceeded its authorized allocation by 3%. The authorization record for this increase does not exist in the Council's administrative files. He looked at Ned. Lord Stark, as Hand, you have the authority to remove a City Watch commander on grounds of administrative irregularity. I would recommend exercising it today. A replacement from among the Baratheon household guard would be appropriate. Ned said, "It will be done." The session ended 10 minutes later. The council members filed out. Renly quickly with the energy of a man who wanted to process something in private. Pycelle carefully with the movement of someone negotiating new and unfamiliar terrain. Stannis without expression, which on Stannis communicated the opposite of nothing. Varys last among the others, pausing at the door to look back at Robert and Joffrey with those careful eyes that were always calculating something and never showed you the result. Petyr Baelish was the last out of the council chamber. He walked to the door at the same pleasant, unhurried pace he'd entered with. His gray doublet was unruffled. His hands were at his sides, loose, the hands of a man with nothing to defend. At the doorway he paused, not turning fully, the pause of a man who had arrived at a thought and was deciding whether to share it. He said it to the corridor rather than to the room. Interesting. The door closed behind him. Robert and Joffrey sat alone in the small chair at the side of the empty table, in the room that smelled of old maps and the extinguished candles from the morning session, and looked at the door through which the most dangerous man in the Seven Kingdoms had just walked away smiling. He had not arrested him. He had not had him seized or charged or imprisoned where the network would immediately begin working to free him. He had done something worse. He had shown Petyr Baelish the shape of what was coming without showing him the timeline, and left him in the world, where the not knowing would do more damage than any cell. But Littlefinger was still breathing. That required watching. He had been watching Jaime Lannister train for 3 weeks, not from anywhere obvious. The training yard in the early morning had enough bodies in it, squires running forms, household knights working through drills, the occasional bannerman sparring with a partner while the dew was still on the stone, that a boy standing at the yard's edge, with his back against the wall, read as a boy watching knights, which was unremarkable, which was the point. What Jaime Lannister did in the training yard at first light was different from what anyone else did. Everyone else was working, running forms, building muscle, repeating the sequences that had been drilled into them through years of instruction until the sequences lived in the body below the reach of thought. This was martial training as craft, the patient, repetitive accumulation of competence. Robert and Joffrey had respect for it. It was how he built the body he'd lived in for 50 years, and it was how he was rebuilding this one, muscle by muscle, morning by morning, the careful, unglamorous work of making a frame into a weapon. Jaime Lannister was not working. He was thinking. That was the only way to describe it. The way he moved through the yard with a practice blade, alone, running no sequence anyone had taught him, working through something that was entirely his own, invented by his own body in response to his own particular geometry of speed and reach, and the specific way his weight moved through his hips. He fought the way artists made things, not by following instruction but by discovering, through repetition and revision, what only he could do. The sword was an extension of a thought he was having, and the thought was continuous, and the yard was simply the space he used to have it. Robert and Joffrey had watched him for 3 weeks, and then sent the formal request. The morning was gray, the sky above the red keep the flat white of overcast that couldn't decide whether to produce rain or simply maintain the threat of it. The yard had been cleared by the time Robert and Joffrey descended from the keep, not by his order but by Jaime's, which was the first thing that registered. Jaime had cleared the yard for this. He had decided somewhere between receiving the request and arriving here that whatever this was, it should not have an audience. He stood in the center of the empty yard in his training clothes, no armor, sword in hand. He watched the 12-year-old cross the cobblestones toward him with the expression of a man who has agreed to something for reasons he has not fully articulated to himself and is now reconsidering in real time. Not the expression he would have worn for Joffrey. Robert and Joffrey had understood, since the tower at Winterfell, that Jaime Lannister was already working from a revised set of assumptions. The man had not slept well for weeks. He had seen something in that broken room, in the Crown Prince's eyes and the Crown Prince's posture, and the Crown Prince's complete absence of the fear he should have shown, that had opened a question he couldn't close. He was here this morning to see if the answer was what he suspected. Robert and Joffrey stopped 6 feet away and looked at the blade in Jaime's hand, a practice sword, wooden, weighted to approximate steel. He picked up the one he'd left by the yard wall, shorter, lighter, the same one he'd been drilling with for months, and turned it once in his grip to find the balance. "Rules," Jaime said. "None." A brief pause. "You're 12. First blood," Robert and Joffrey said, "or until one of us stops." The thing that crossed Jaime Lannister's face then was not amusement and not contempt. It was the expression of a man recalibrating the distance between himself and something he'd misidentified. He raised his blade. They began. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds. Robert and Joffrey came forward with a measured opening, not the aggressive rush that Joffrey's reputation would have suggested, not the cautious retreat that a sensible 12-year-old should have chosen. A lateral entry, weight even, blade angled to draw a response rather than force one. Jaime obliged with something easy, a mid-level deflection that covered 3 possible follow-ups, and then closed the distance before the deflection had fully resolved. The wooden blade hit Robert and Joffrey's left shoulder with controlled force, enough to register, not enough to damage. Robert and Joffrey stepped back, rolled the shoulder once, and came forward again. The second exchange was longer. Jaime was paying attention now, the easy economy of the opening gone, his footwork tightening as the 12-year-old in front of him moved in ways that accumulated wrongness with each passing second. The angles were wrong, not bad wrong, wrong in the specific way of a body working from a different geometry than the one it actually possessed, a brain sending instructions calibrated for a frame 6 inches taller and 80 pounds heavier. The reach calculations were off, but the footwork underneath them was not the footwork of a boy. It was the footwork of someone who had been reading combat for a very long time. Jaime feinted high and went low, and Robert and Joffrey read the feint, and moved to cover the low, and was a half-second too slow because the body didn't have the hip drop yet. The fast twitch wasn't there. The muscle had been building for months, but months was not 40 years. The wooden blade caught him across the ribs. He went down onto one knee. The pain spread across his side in the dull wave that wooden training weapons made instead of the sharp report of steel. Less honest than steel, but present, insistent, the kind of pain that spoke. He breathed through it. 1 breath, 2. His hand stayed on his own blade. He got up. Jaime Lannister stood 6 feet away and watched him get up with an expression that had moved somewhere beyond the professional and into something more personal. He had knocked men down in training yards his entire life, and they responded in one of 3 ways. They called the bout, they came back angrier and sloppier, or they came back afraid, the anger covering the fear badly. The 12-year-old in front of him was doing none of these things. He was standing up with the same weight distribution he'd had before the fall, the same measured read of the distance, the pain somewhere below the expression rather than in it. The same way Robert Baratheon had stood back up at Stony Sept with a blade in his side, the same way he came back at every field where someone had managed to put steel in him. Jaime's jaw shifted. They went again. The third exchange ran longer than either of the first 2, and was the first one in which Robert and Joffrey stopped trying to win and started trying to get close. He ate a strike to the forearm, absorbing it against the bone, with the particular resignation of a man managing a cost he'd already agreed to pay, stepped inside the Ark of the Recovery and drove his shoulder into Jaime's chest with all the weight this body had to give. Not enough to move him. Jaime was 6 feet of trained soldier, and the shoulder hit like a child's. But it was the right mechanics, the clinch mechanics. The move of a man who knew that inside the arc of a long blade you were safer than outside it, and that at close quarters the variables changed in ways that size didn't always win. They were chest to chest. Jaime's free hand went to Robert and Joffrey's collar. Robert and Joffrey's blade was pinned between them, useless, and Jaime's was behind him, equally useless, and for 3 seconds they were pressed together in the specific impasse of two fighters who had both run out of useful room and were working on the next problem. Robert and Joffrey turned his face up toward Jaime's and set it quietly with the full weight of knowledge behind it, into the 6 inches of space between them. "I know whose blood I carry, Kingslayer." Jaime went very still. "I know what you did in the throne room while the Mad King burned his own people, while the smoke came under the doors and the bells were ringing. He kept his voice below carrying distance, below anything the empty yard could catch and hold. I know you knelt behind Aerys with your blade drawn, and I know what he was screaming at Rosark when you put the steel in. I know what was buried beneath King's Landing, beneath the Dragon Pit, beneath the city's streets, within the very walls, and I know what would have happened to every man, woman, and child in King's Landing if you had kept your oath the way everyone has spent 20 years wishing you had." The grip on his collar did not loosen, it did not tighten. Jaime's hand had simply stopped performing either function and had become a grip for its own sake, maintaining the clinch because releasing it required deciding to release it, and he had not yet arrived at that decision. "You are not what they say you are," Robert and Joffrey said. "The Kingslayer, the Oathbreaker, the man who sat on the throne until the rightful king arrived to claim it. You are a man who saved a city and has spent 20 years allowing the world to misread that as the worst thing he has ever done. He let the silence carry for one beat. Neither am I what they say I am." He stepped back. Jaime's hand fell from his collar. He stood in the center of the empty yard with his practice blade at his side and looked at the 12-year-old 3 feet in front of him, and what was happening on his face was not something Jaime Lannister showed people. The face he showed people was beautiful and careless, and designed specifically to prevent this. The thing underneath reaching the surface, the part of him that the Kingslayer identity existed to protect from view. The part that was still, 20 years later, kneeling on the steps of the Iron Throne in a dead king's blood, wondering if anyone would ever ask him why. He said nothing. He sheathed his practice blade with a motion so controlled it was a kind of violence, the precision of a man applying all of himself to a simple physical task because the alternative was applying himself to what he had just heard. He walked away. Not quickly. Jaime Lannister did not do things quickly when doing them slowly was a choice. He crossed the training yard with the same unhurried grace he crossed every room, the carelessness worn externally while whatever the carelessness was covering worked at speed underneath. He did not look back. Robert and Joffrey stood in the center of the empty yard, with his ribs aching and his forearm announcing itself with every breath, and watched the Kingslayer walk through the yard's archway and disappear into the shadows of the keep's interior corridor. He had not won the bout. He'd been knocked down twice and taken 3 clean strikes, and managed 1 clinch that lasted 3 seconds before the size differential made it unsustainable. He picked up the practice blade he'd dropped in the 3rd exchange, turned it once in his grip, and began running the form again. The elbow level, the weight forward, again. He had been awake since the 2nd hour of the night. Not from insomnia, he had laid down fully dressed on top of the bed's furs at sundown, and slept for 4 hours with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had learned in 40 years of campaigns that rest was a resource lost wars. He woke at the 2nd hour because he had decided to wake at the 2nd hour, and his body had been receiving and following that instruction for long enough that no bell was required. He rose, checked the short blade at his hip, and went to the window. The Red Keep at night was not dark. That was the thing about fortresses. The darkness existed in the interstices, in the gaps between where the torchlight reached, and what occupied those gaps was not absence but attention. Men standing in shadows with reasons for being in shadows. The accumulated watchfulness of a place that had housed power long enough to understand that power, at its most vulnerable, slept. He had spent 3 weeks learning where the shadows moved. Cersei had been careful. He could grant her that with something close to admiration. The precision of it, the unhurried assembly of the required components. She had not panicked after the council chamber. She had not moved against Ned directly, which was what she'd done in the original sequence, The move that had required Slint's gold cloaks, and had worked because Ned was outnumbered in a city full of men whose loyalty she controlled. She had understood without being told that those conditions no longer obtained. Slint was gone. The financial audit was squeezing the network she used to move gold. Pycelle's correspondence was under review, so she had gone for the simplest thing, the king's person. Not a public move, not an accusation, not a political gambit, nothing that required the machinery of court. Simply the king under the influence of people she chose, in rooms she controlled, signing what she needed him to sign. A quiet reorganization of who stood between the Iron Throne and the decisions that actually governed the realm. It was elegant in the way that desperate things were sometimes elegant, stripped of everything unnecessary by the pressure of circumstance until only the essential mechanism remained. Robert and Joffrey had been watching her build it for 2 weeks. He left his chambers and walked the interior corridor toward the king's rooms. Old Robert was already awake. That had been the specific and necessary variable, getting old Robert to understand, 3 days prior, what was coming and what he needed to do when it arrived. Not in detail. Old Robert's instinct when presented with detailed plans was to modify them, and modified plans in the middle of the night were loose plans, and loose plans produced the wrong kind of improvisation. He'd said it simply: stay in your chambers tonight, bar the door to no one, have your sword to hand, and when the noise comes, let it come to you. Old Robert had looked at him the way he'd been looking at him since the Solar, with the particular attention of a man who had made a decision to trust something he didn't fully understand, and was now living inside that decision night by night. He'd said, "You're certain." Robert and Joffrey had said, "She'll move tonight or tomorrow night. The audit documentation goes to the Iron Bank's envoy at first light day after tomorrow. She is running out of time to move before the numbers are in other people's hands." Old Robert had said nothing further. He had his sword. The Lannister household guard came down the corridor from the West Passage at the 3rd hour, 12 men in formation, not the full livery, but close enough. The Lannister crimson under traveling cloaks, attempting the balance between visible authority and deniable intent. Their captain was a man Robert and Joffrey had catalogued weeks ago, solid, competent, completely loyal to Cersei in the personal way that men became loyal to women who paid them well and remembered their names. They rounded the corner toward the king's chambers and stopped. The door was held by 8 Baratheon men-at-arms, not household retainers, men-at-arms, professional soldiers from the Storm's End garrison that Stannis had brought south 3 days prior, standing in the corridor in full kit with the patient stillness of men who had been told exactly where to stand, and had been standing there for 2 hours. At the center of the corridor, between the Baratheon men and the Lannister men, stood old Robert. He had not put on his armor. He was in his sleeping clothes with a sword in his right hand, and the sword was Stormbreaker, the one that had come back from the Trident, with rubies still worked into the guard, and he was holding it with the ease of a man whose arm had grown up around that grip. He was 50 years old and gone to fat, and his face had the look of a man who had been given a reason, after years of having no reason, to be angry in a direction that was worth being angry in. He looked at the captain of Cersei's guard the way he'd looked at men before battles. "Turn around," Robert said. The captain didn't move. Discipline, or the more dangerous thing, the calculus of a man who understood that the order he'd been given originated somewhere above a king's sleeping clothes in a corridor, and that going back without completing it had consequences he hadn't fully priced. "I am the king," Robert said. That is not a complicated sentence. Cersei came through the guard formation. She had dressed for this, not in court clothes, in traveling clothes, the practical wool that communicated urgency rather than theater. Her hair was only partly arranged, which on Cersei was a statement as deliberate as the arrangement would have been. She came to the front of her guard and looked at her husband in the corridor with the expression of a woman who is committed to a position and has decided that commitment requires it to be maintained past the point of comfort. "Robert." The voice managed the register between wifely concern and queenly authority with the precision of long practice. "You should be in your chambers. Pycelle has said—" "Pycelle," old Robert said, "has been reading my medical records to you for 15 years. We're going to talk about that, but not tonight and not in this corridor." He raised the sword slightly, not a threat, a clarification, the position of a man making his meaning unmistakable. "Tonight you are going to take your men back to your rooms, and in the morning you are going to be present when Ned Stark reads you a formal accounting of what you have done with the crown's finances, and what you have done with my household, and what you have done for 15 years in rooms you believed I wasn't paying attention to." Cersei looked past him, past the Baratheon men-at-arms, looking for Joffrey. Robert and Joffrey was standing at the corridor's eastern end, where the passage turned toward the outer wall. Not behind the Baratheon men, separate from them, leaning against the stone with his arms at his sides, watching. He held her gaze when she found him. Her face did the thing it had done in the broken tower. The mask holding but the thing behind the mask working, reassessing, running the variables that had just changed against the variables she'd built her plan around. She was looking at her son and finding, for the third time in the months since Winterfell, something in his face that her maternal architecture had no category for. Footsteps from the south passage. Ned came around the corner with 6 of his household guard, the older men, the ones Robert and Joffrey had been watching since Winterfell. Not 20 men in a city that had turned against him. 6 men in a corridor that was already won. Then from the west staircase, which opened 30 feet behind Cersei's guard, the sound of more feet, more deliberately placed, the rhythm of men who were trained not to hurry, and expressed that training in the way they arrived at situations rather than the way they ran to them. Stannis came through the staircase door. He had brought 10 men, and he had brought them fully armed, which was either the most Stannis thing possible or a statement of intent, and with Stannis the two were generally the same thing. He walked through his men until he was standing at Cersei's back, and the geometry of the corridor reorganized itself entirely. Baratheon men ahead, Baratheon men behind, the king and his sword between them, Ned at one end with his household guard, Stannis at the other with 10 soldiers whose loyalties had never been in question. Cersei's guard captain understood the mathematics. Cersei turned to look at Stannis. The expression she gave him was not fear. It was the expression reserved for things she had accounted for and found manageable. The expression of a woman telling herself the story of how this was recoverable, because the alternative to that story was a thing she was not prepared to stand in the middle of a corridor and feel. Stannis looked at her with the face he kept for things that required no expression. "You are in the king's corridor with armed men," he said, "in the middle of the night." A pause. "This is treason." "This is a wife seeing to her husband's." "This is treason," Stannis said again, with the flat emphasis of a man for whom repetition was not rhetorical but definitional. He was not interested in her explanations. He had never been interested in explanations when the facts were legible. The Lannister captain was looking at his men, and they were looking at the corridor and doing the arithmetic. 12 against 8, plus the king, plus 6, plus 10. The arithmetic produced a figure. He sheathed his sword. The men behind him followed. Cersei stood at the center of a collapsing architecture and did not move. She had the stillness of a woman who was already building the next position from the rubble of this one, the lioness not defeated but cornered, which was different, which was in many ways more dangerous. She turned to find Jaime. Jaime Lannister was in the western passage's shadow. He had been there since before Cersei's guard had arrived. Robert and Joffrey had known where he was, had tracked him for the last hour. He stood with his sword sheathed and his arms at his sides, and he was looking at his sister with an expression Robert and Joffrey had never seen on Jaime Lannister's face in any life he'd lived. Not conflict. The thing that came after conflict. The thing a man wore when the conflict had resolved, when the weighing was done, when whatever had been balanced against whatever else had finally tipped one way permanently and the tipping had cost something real. Cersei looked at him. He held her gaze, and he did nothing. The hound materialized from the shadow at Robert and Joffrey's shoulder without being summoned the way he had taken to appearing in the months since the road south. Not assigned, not commanded, simply present in the way that things position themselves around a point of gravity. He said nothing. He watched the corridor with the professional attention of a man auditing a situation for its remaining threat. Old Robert lowered the sword. "Escort the queen to her chambers," he said to the nearest of his men. 2 guards at the door. "No one in or out without my written order." He looked down the corridor at Robert and Joffrey. Something passed between them in the torchlight. Not words, not the language of fathers and sons that they had never spoken and would not begin now. The language of men who had stood in the same position against the same thing, and had won, and were now standing in the aftermath of winning, and feeling the weight of what it had cost to get here. Old Robert turned and walked back into his chambers. The door closed. In the corridor, Jaime Lannister pushed off from the wall and walked west without looking at anyone. His footsteps receded down the passage, measured, unhurried, the gait of a man walking towards something he had not yet identified, or away from something he could no longer return to, and in the dark of the Red Keep's interior it was impossible to tell which. The throne room was built for one thing, not governance, not ceremony, not the administration of law, not the practical business of running a continent. It was built for the moment when a man stood at the far end of it and looked down its length at the Iron Throne and understood in the marrow what it meant to stand between that throne and everything that wanted it. Aegon the Conqueror had understood this. He had taken the swords of his enemies and melted them into a seat deliberately made uncomfortable, deliberately made grotesque, deliberately made to look like what it was, not a reward, but a sentence. You sat on the Iron Throne because you had won the right to. You sat on it knowing that everyone who hadn't won that right was already planning how to take it from you. Robert and Joffrey stood at the room's far end and looked at it for a long time before going in. The session was called for mid-morning. Not a full court session, no lords assembled from across the realm, no public gallery, no heralds with their long announcement staffs standing at the doors. The chamber held the small council, the senior household staff required to witness and record, 2 representatives of the City Watch in their new livery, and the members of the Baratheon family who had been notified the night before and had arrived without requiring explanation. Ned at the hand's position, Stannis in the seat he'd occupied 3 times now as if he'd never left it. Renly with the slightly wide-eyed quality of a man who had been peripheral to several consequential events in rapid succession and was still assembling the picture. Varys was present. He had been present at everything and said almost nothing at any of it, and watched Robert and Joffrey with the focused interest of a man in the middle of revising a very long document. Old Robert walked to the Iron Throne. He didn't rush it. He climbed the steps with the careful mechanics of a large man whose knees had opinions about stairs, and he sat down on the thing the way he'd sat down on it before, with the particular reluctance of a man taking a seat he'd spent 20 years resenting. But something was different. He didn't slouch, he didn't position himself sideways with his legs thrown over the arm the way he'd taken to doing in later years, the posture of a man refusing to give the chair the satisfaction of being sat in properly. He sat in it straight, upright, with the sword across his knees and his eyes forward. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like the man who had won the thing. The chamber went quiet. "The following decrees are issued by the king's own word," said the chamberlain, "and witnessed by those present, and will be entered into the official rolls before this session ends." Old Robert's voice, when it came, carried the way it always had across distances that required it. Not the wine-thickened bluster of recent years, the campaign voice, the voice of a man issuing orders that would be followed because the alternative was not something he was prepared to tolerate. Cersei Lannister, Queen, is hereby confined to her chambers in the Red Keep pending formal inquiry into conduct pertaining to the management of the king's household and the crown's finances. She will be attended by staff of the king's choosing. No correspondence will leave or arrive without review by the hand of the king. This confinement stands until the inquiry is resolved. The chamberlain wrote, "The witnesses held still. The crown's finances are placed under formal audit. The review panel consists of the Hand, the Master of Ships, and the Iron Bank's envoy in the city, as representative of the Iron Bank of Bravos. The panel has full access to all records, ledgers, accounts, and correspondence pertaining to crown revenue and expenditure for the past 15 years. Their findings will be reported to the throne within 60 days. The position of Master of Coin is vacant pending new appointment." Stannis, at the table below the steps, wrote something at the top of a clean piece of parchment, without being asked. By royal decree, mining operations for Dragonglass are to begin at Dragonstone without delay. The Master of Ships will oversee extraction and logistics. All materials produced will be transported to castle armories across the realm at the crown's expense, prioritizing the northern castles and the fortifications along the wall. The Night's Watch is to be formally notified and will receive a substantial portion of any stockpile built. This one produced the room's first movement, Renly glancing at Stannis, Stannis's expression doing nothing in response. Ned looking at the throne with the contained quality of a man hearing something he'd been told was coming, and finding that hearing it formally was different from being told. Letters are to be dispatched within the week to all lords paramount, requesting honest and detailed accounting of conditions at the wall and in the lands below it. These letters go under the king's seal, and the responses are to be forwarded to the Hand and the Master of Ships without editing. Finally, old Robert's voice changed register by a fraction, not softer, but more deliberate, the voice of a man arriving at the thing he'd been building toward. "Sir Jaime Lannister is relieved of his position as Lord Commander of the King's Guard, pending inquiry into his conduct and service. He is not charged. He is not confined. He remains under the Crown's observation. The Lord Commander's vacancy will be filled on the Hand's recommendation. The Chamberlain sealed the documents. The session ended. They left in the order they'd come, Ned last among the council members, pausing at the base of the throne steps to look up at old Robert and exchange something too brief to be called a conversation. A look, held for 2 seconds. The compressed communication of men who had been reading each other across distances for 40 years and had learned that most of what mattered didn't require words. Then Ned was gone, and the household staff and the witnesses and the watch representatives. Stannis was the last of them. He stopped at the throne room's great doors and turned back, and he looked at the Iron Throne with the expression of a man completing an accounting. "It should have been mine," he said, not to anyone in particular. The flat statement of a fact that had been true for 20 years, and was still true and would remain true regardless of what anyone in the room thought about it. Old Robert looked at his brother. "I know," he said. Stannis held that for a moment. Then he walked out, and the great doors closed behind him, and the throne room was empty except for the two of them. Robert and Joffrey walked to the foot of the throne steps and stopped. The room was very large from this position. He had forgotten, in the months of small chambers and council tables and corridors, how large it actually was, the ceiling vaulting upward into shadow, the long walk from the doors to the dais designed to make the approach feel like a journey, the rows of pillars on either side catching the light from the high windows and distributing it in the cold, directionless way of stone rooms that existed before anyone had thought carefully about warmth. The Iron Throne caught no light particularly, it absorbed it. 1,000 swords fused into something that looked less like furniture and more like what it had been in the beginning. A monument, a statement, the physical form of a question that Aegon had posed to the continent, and that the continent had been answering, in blood and fire and calculation, ever since. Old Robert looked down from it at the 12-year-old at the foot of the steps. "Everything you said would happen," he said. "Cersei moving, the corridor, the guard. Yes, you knew the night, not just the plan. Yes," old Robert's hands moved on the sword across his knees, the old habit of a man thinking through his hands. "I have spent 20 years sitting on this thing and not sitting on it, which is worse. Letting other people do the ruling because ruling required me to care about things I had decided not to care about." He wasn't looking for a response. He was saying it the way men said the things they'd been not saying for long enough, that the not saying had become its own kind of weight. "I was a better king during the rebellion than I was after it. That's a terrible thing to know about yourself." "You knew it," Robert and Joffrey said. "You've known it for years. Knowing it and doing something about it are two different problems." "They are," Robert and Joffrey said. "They're different problems, and you're working on the second one now." Old Robert looked at him. The light from the high windows came down at an angle across the throne and caught the right side of his face and left the left in shadow. And in that divided light he looked like the man Robert and Joffrey remembered from before the throne. From the years when the future was still a thing being decided, rather than a thing being managed. "I don't know what you are," old Robert said. "I have been trying to find a name for it since the Solar, and I don't have one." He paused. "But you fight like me." Robert and Joffrey looked at the Iron Throne above him, at the swords, at the specific, ugly, magnificent wrongness of a seat made from weapons that had been used to kill people, the most honest possible material for the most dishonest possible object, the physical truth of what power actually was underneath the ceremony built around it. He thought about the boar, about the wine that had slowed him, about Cersei's face in the tent and whether the expression she'd worn when the boar charged had been relief or simply the absence of intervention that looked like relief. He thought about the long unraveling that had started the moment the rebellion ended, and he had sat down on this thing and discovered that the thing he'd wanted for 20 years was not the thing he'd thought he wanted. He thought about the wall, about what was north of it and how much time was left, and how many swords the living had and how many they would need. "I lost it once," he said to a boar. He kept his eyes on the throne. "I won't lose it to the dead." He turned and walked the length of the throne room toward the great doors. His footsteps carried in the empty space, too small for the room, the walk of a 12-year-old body that was not yet what it would be, that had months and years of work between what it currently was and what was required of it. He pushed the doors open. The light from the corridor beyond came in at him, warmer than the throne room's light, carrying the smell of the keep's kitchen somewhere below, and the salt of the bay through a distant window, and the sound of the city going about its enormous, ungovernable life 200 feet below the walls. He walked through. Behind him, in the great echoing throne room, old Robert sat on the iron throne in the cold light from the high windows and did not move. He sat with the sword across his knees and his back straight and his eyes forward. For the first time in 20 years, he looked like a king. In the weeks that followed, the dragon glass shipments began moving north. The first ravens from the Night's Watch arrived in the third week, longer than expected and shorter than feared. Ned Stark read them in his study at the Tower of the Hand and did not sleep well afterward. In her chambers, Cersei sat at a window overlooking the courtyard and made her lists. At the wall, Jon Snow stood his watches and did not know his name. North of the wall, in the cold that had no season, something old and patient moved through the dark and did not hurry, because it had learned across 10,000 years that the living always gave it time. Robert and Joffrey trained in the mornings, built the body day by day toward what was needed, waited. There was a great deal left to do, but Ned Stark was alive. The dragon glass was moving, and for the first time since Robert Baratheon put a warhammer through a prince's chest on the banks of the Trident, someone in King's Landing was playing the right game. Let me know what you'd like to see next. The end?